It followed from the special theory of relativity that mass and energy are different manifestations of the same thing.
Now researchers have stopped light cold and then brought it back to life, or light, in an entirely different place. The Harvard researchers sent a light pulse into a sodium cloud cooled to about 460 degrees below zero. That's the theoretical point, where matter stops all movement. The light pulse was compressed by a factor of about 50 million at the extreme temperature, and it actually changed state, sort of like frozen water. But it also split into two forms of matter. One stayed frozen in the sodium, while the other crawled along at just 200 meters per hour. That second form, called a matter wave, contains the exact information of the original light wave. And when researchers sent it into a second sodium cloud a fraction of a millimeter away, the wave was converted back into light. And since fiber optic communications use light, that means that someday we may be able to stop them, store them, and turn them back on, just like a light switch.
That's Generation Zero of Darwin Tunes. It's a website researchers are using to study how listener preferences affect the evolution of music. A new study claims that the taste of the public exerts a force on music similar to natural selection. The findings support the theory that culture and art are shaped not only by their producers, but by consumers too. The report is in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Researchers created short tunes and allowed them to procreate. That is, they'd combine aspects of the parent tunes to produce a new generation of music. User ratings on the Darwin Tunes site provided the evolutionary selection, with only the most appealing tunes allowed to create progeny. The researchers found that quality increased quickly at the beginning. The random sounds rapidly gave rise to something an awful lot like music. Here's Generation 600. But after a while, things stagnated. The researchers plan to update the program to drive evolution further. Meanwhile, here's Darwin Tunes Generation 3000.
It's Friday the 13th.
You've got to ask yourself a question. Do I feel lucky?
If you don't, you could be suffering from triskaidekaphobia. That's a fear of the number 13. Napoleon, Herbert Hoover, and FDR are well-documented triskaidekaphobics. But why do folks think 13 is unlucky, particularly when it falls on a Friday, as it will 3 times this year? The University of Delaware's Thomas Fernsler is known as Dr. 13. He's an expert on the number's bad reputation, which may date back to biblical times. After all, the 13th guest at the Last Supper was Judas, and you know how that worked out for Jesus, who was crucified on a Friday. Other factoids from Fernsler: the first person to die in a car accident was killed in New York City on September the 13th in 1899, although that was a Wednesday. And the ill-fated flight of Apollo the 13th launched at the 13th minute of the 13th hour, Central Standard Time, on April 11th, 1970. And the numerals in the date 4/11/70 add up to, gasp, 13, as long as you don't include the 19 in 1970. Hey, sometimes superstition can be hard work. Today, some tall buildings lack a 13th floor. Well, they have a 13th floor, but they call it the 14th floor, because the purveyors of bad luck are apparently easily fooled. Meanwhile, over in France, panicky Parisian party throwers can even hire a quatorzième, a professional 14th guest. Like Judas, Mark Twain was allegedly once poised to be the 13th guest at a dinner party. A superstitious friend warned the very rational Twain not to go. But Twain went. It was bad luck, he later remarked. They only had food for 12.
Using less energy saves money and lowers greenhouse gas emissions, and various studies have looked at ways to get households to use less energy. Now there's evidence that people in such a study use less energy because they're in a study. The general phenomenon is called the Hawthorne effect. Study subjects change their behavior because they're being observed. So researchers collaborated with a utility to test for the Hawthorne effect in electricity use. They monitored almost 5,600 randomly selected households. Half received a postcard saying that their energy use would be monitored for a month for research purposes. They also got 4 follow-up reminder postcards over the month. They received no other information, instructions, or incentives. The control group monitored for the study got no notifications. That group continued using the same amount of electricity, but the families being tracked reduced energy use 2.7%, and when the study period ended, their energy use shot back up. The report is in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Clearly, mindful consumers can find ways to easily lower their energy consumption. Perhaps policymakers can find a way to use the Hawthorne effect to everyone's advantage. In vitro fertilization efforts can be helped by, oddly enough, oral contraceptives. That's the finding from Tel Aviv University, site of the largest study on using birth control to help IVF. One of the challenges to IVF is timing. Current hormone treatments to stimulate ovulation have to coincide with a particular moment in the woman's cycle. Not knowing the exact timing for scheduling the egg retrieval and fertilization can be stressful, which can lower the odds of success. In the Tel Aviv study, researchers looked at women who underwent a 12 to 17-day treatment of oral contraception. The women were checked to make sure there was absolutely no activity in their ovaries or uterus. Then they began stimulation hormones to start the clock. Women who went through this protocol had similar numbers of pregnancies to a control group that didn't use birth control, which means that oral contraception didn't harm their ability to conceive. The researchers say this treatment demands a slightly longer cycle and higher levels of ovulation-inducing hormones, but they also say it could allow couples to more accurately plan for procedures, which might give couples more peace of mind.
Black mamba is one of the world's most venomous snakes. Its bite can kill a human in just half an hour. But along with deadly neurotoxins, the black mamba's venom has a special ingredient, a painkiller as potent as morphine. So says a study in the journal Nature. Researchers isolated proteins from mamba venom called mambal genes and injected them into mice. Then they tested how long it took those mice to yank their paws out of water heated to a painful but not damaging 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Turns out mice treated with mambal genes could take the heat for just as long as mice dosed with morphine, indicating the two drugs had similar pain-relieving effects. Morphine works by binding opioid receptors, but mambal genes target a completely different pain pathway, which is a good thing, because they don't slow down breathing like opiates, and the body doesn't build up tolerance to mambal genes as fast as it does to morphine, meaning mambal genes could keep the pain away for longer. The French company TheraAlpha is now developing a drug from the venom. Just don't call it snake oil.
Happy New Year! And if you've been away from work for a few days, you deserve some time off. After all, you've traveled far, even if you just stayed at home. According to NASA, just by being on the planet Earth in the last year, you zipped about 584 million miles around the sun at an average speed of about 67,000 miles per hour. Hey, I wasn't speeding in my inertial reference frame. Of course, the trip was not a perfect circle. As Kepler showed, the Earth's orbit is an ellipse, with the Sun at one of the two focal points. He also figured out the planet goes faster when it's at perihelion, nearer the Sun, than when it's at aphelion, its furthest distance, which would explain why summer seems to zip by, except that the seasons are a function of the tilt of the Earth's axis, not its different distances from the sun. And the Earth rotated 365 and a quarter times during its sweep around the sun. The trip took 8,766 hours, or 525,960 minutes, or 31,557,600 seconds.
What makes someone sound sexy?
Do I make you Randy?
To get a scientific viewpoint, researchers gauged volunteers' responses to different voices. The conclusion: voices considered attractive send messages about body size. The work is in the journal PLOS ONE. In the animal kingdom, sound indicates size and intentions. For example, a rough and low frequency call suggests that the vocalizer is large and aggressive, while a clearer, higher frequency signals a small, non-threatening animal. In the study, researchers adjusted a variety of voices to correspond with different body sizes. To do so, they synthesized completely artificial voices and recorded sentences before varying the pitches and resonance. When volunteers listened to the sound samples, men preferred higher-pitched female voices like this one, which suggests a smaller body size. Low-frequency male voices that signaled a large body size were attractive to females. Interestingly, breathiness made both male and female voices more desirable. It certainly explains the enduring popularity of Happy Birthday to you.
This year, the number of mobile phones on cell networks is expected to surpass the Earth's population.
More people now own cell phones than actually have access to working toilets.
James Meadow, a microbial ecologist at the University of Oregon. Hidden in the data is the reality that some people work on their phones on toilets. If that grosses you out, consider this.
So it turns out that we're just really leaky animals. We leave our bacteria everywhere we go.
Including, of course, our phones. Meadow and his colleagues took a census of the bacteria on thumbs and index fingers of 17 volunteers, and on their smartphone touchscreens. Overall, they ID'd more than 7,000 types. Looking at just the most common bacteria, those that appear more than 0.1% of the time, they found an 82% similarity between the microbiomes of fingers and phones, meaning our phones are a pretty good mirror of ourselves, microbially at least. The results appear in the journal PeerJ.
We have always been covered in bacteria, and we will always be covered in bacteria.
So the fact that our phones are also covered in bacteria is no reason for concern. In fact, the researchers say that mobile phones may hold untapped potential as personal microbiome sensors.
How can you tell the difference between a French baby and a German baby? No, it's not that one is wearing a saucy little beret while the other is tucked into a tiny pair of lederhosen. Well, maybe that's part of it. But a new study in the journal Current Biology shows that the babies actually sound different because the melody of an infant's cry matches its mother tongue. We all know that babies start eavesdropping while they're still in the womb, so when they come out, they know their mother's voice. When they're older, they start to imitate the sounds they hear. Eventually they babble, and then start to speak, and then you never hear the end of it.
Hey, Mom!
But long before that first burble or coo, babies are learning the elements of language. A team of scientists recorded the cries of 60 newborns, 30 born into French-speaking families, and 30 that heard German. And they found that French infants wail on a rising note, while the Germans favor a falling melody. Those patterns match the rhythms of their native languages. So next time you hear a baby cry, listen closely. He could be telling you where he's from.